And once the work is Well, welcome back. I understand a lot of our previous sessions, our breakout ones were standing room only, which we're a little bit of a victim of our own success, I guess, in having so many of you in those sessions, but we really appreciate it. I hope that the conversation, the learning from those breakout sessions are so important. We have a large geography, and so regionally focusing collectively on the great work and the challenges and the successes is really, really important. And I want to welcome you to our lunch. It is just overwhelming to see this level of support. We also have an overflow, as I shared in my opening remarks, and so we'll have another almost 100 people in the overflow. They'll be able to see video, and it'll be able to hear us and have the audio there as well. But as people come in, if you have seats at your table, our team is going to try and help direct people to them. But if you've got someone who's looking for a table and you have a seat at yours, please raise your hand, invite them to your table. Right? I'm going to make sure my team sends more people in here because we've got more over here. Make new friends, network with people, right? Join them in this incredible work. So I am incredibly excited to kick off our first keynote of our conference. And, it's important that you start out strong and you carry that all the way through. We had the opportunity this morning to be inspired by a number of our electeds, and I shared how important the political will is of those who do this work. And I want to introduce another incredible partner to this work. Councilmember Whitburn is not only amazing in the space, but he also serves on our board. And, so he's working on this daily. He has the district that has the largest homeless population. And, when we reached out to him and said, Councilman, what would you like to do at the conference? This was, what he asked about, is being able to kick off our keynote speaker. I want to share that we know how challenging housing is. And as I said, you're going to learn a lot about the market. And I think this is something that, as Stephen Whitburn knows, housing is challenging in the downtown area and is something that we need to message better, we need to be clear about the challenges, and we also need to speak about the solutions as well. So I am incredibly honored and deeply appreciate the council member kicking off our keynote.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Tamara. As a board member of the RTFH Continuum of Care, I have a real appreciation for what the RTFH does. And I also know that it is a real endeavor to pull together a conference like this one, especially for the first time. So can we acknowledge Tamara and her team on an amazing conference that we have going on right here? It is so impressive, and I am so proud to be having it here in downtown San Diego. It's great to see all these people here in this room. Great to see you in the overflow room as well. And it's really great to be with you this afternoon. Many of us know each other, but for those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, again, my name is Stephen Whitburn. I have the pleasure of representing downtown San Diego on the San Diego City Council. It includes downtown and Balboa Park and all the central urban neighborhoods around it. There are about 150,000 people in the district, and over 2,000 of them are experiencing homelessness. It is by far the #1 issue that people reach out to my office about. Those who call to express their concerns about the humanitarian crisis that they see in front of them on the streets, and those who call because they are concerned about the impacts that homelessness is having on their neighborhoods and on the businesses. It's also the #1 issue that I am personally focused on. So first of all, let me thank you, each and every one of you, for all that you are doing on this issue, whether it is through the city or through the Housing Commission or the county or the RTFH or through housing providers or service providers or other organizations or individually, whatever capacity it is that you are engaging with this issue and being part of the solution, know how grateful I am and how grateful my constituents are for all that you are doing. Together, we are doing a tremendous amount to address this crisis. I'll tell you just very briefly about a few initiatives that I am personally working on. One of them, many of you may have heard that we are going to be rebuilding the Civic Center Plaza where City Hall is located. Right now, on the Civic Center concourse area, we have about 550 folks who are housed in a shelter there. I believe that as we grow that Civic Center Plaza and expand it, that we should also take the opportunity on that city property to expand the shelter and other housing that we have that can get our homeless people into housing. I had an opportunity last year to visit Denver, downtown Denver. I went with San Diego Downtown Partnership. And one of the things that we talked about was safe camping. They have an effective safe camping program at a few different sites in Denver, and it is something I am excited about having here in San Diego as well. We have spoken to people on the streets who have said that they would take advantage of safe camping if we have it. We'll be opening up a safe camping site in downtown San Diego in the coming months, and I will be looking at adding an even larger site in the months to follow. We also need to clarify our enforcement policies in San Diego. Right now, when the city enforces policies around encampments and such, we're using rules like illegal lodging and encroachment. I think we need to be a little bit more clear and a little bit more straightforward about how we address that issue. So I'll be bringing forward an ordinance that clarifies how we approach that. And one last thing that I'm working on that I think is very relevant is revising our city's towing policies. Right now, it's incredible. If your car gets towed by the city of San Diego for a parking violation, too many tickets, registration violation, it goes to an impound. And to get your car out of the impound, it is hundreds of dollars at a minimum. And if you don't have that hundreds of dollars, the car gets sold off at auction to the highest bidder. Take a guess at how many vehicles have been sold off after they were towed by the city of San Diego and not picked up at the impound. Guess how many in the last 6 years? 32,000. It's a staggering number. Imagine the impact on those people. If you lose your car, you could have trouble getting to work. If you have trouble getting to work, you could lose your home. If you lose your home, then you're part of our conversation here today. That's one big way that we could take a step to address this. There's a lot going on, but we also know that we have seen an increase in the number of people who are on our streets. For every 10 people that we help off the street, another 13 fall into homelessness in San Diego. San Diego is one of the least affordable cities in the nation when it comes to the amount of people's incomes that they spend on rent. And that amount has gone up. For many people, it means tightening the belt, spending a little less money on other things. But for many others, it's completely unworkable, and they end up losing their homes. They become one of my constituents who's experiencing homelessness. We know that we need many, many more homes that a lot more people can afford if we're going to reduce the number of people who are experiencing homelessness. That is why I am delighted this afternoon to introduce Gregg Colburn, who is the author of Homelessness is a Housing Crisis. And he's going to dive further into just how our lack of homes is leading to more homelessness. Gregg Colburn is an assistant professor in the Runstad Department of Real Estate at the University of Washington. He conducts research on a range of topics, including housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homelessness. His research has been published in leading journals such as Urban Studies, urban affairs review, housing studies, and housing policy debate. Gregg is active in the Puget Sound region, working with community partners such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, King County, Bellwether Housing, and Sound Communities. He earned an MBA from Northwestern University, an MSW from the University of Minnesota, and a PhD in public policy from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Most recently, as mentioned, Gregg is the co-author of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, with Clayton Page Aldern. As the title states, they seek to explain the substantial variation in rates of homelessness apparent in cities across the United States. So please join me in welcoming Gregg to the stage to kick off our lunch keynote. We're excited to hear about his work. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, all. Thank you for the generous introduction. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invite to San Diego. You have a beautiful city. I got in late last night. It's snowing in Seattle. Greetings from snowy Seattle. And my flight was delayed, and so I got in about 12:30 or 1, and this morning I was a little tired, and I'm staying at the Hilton, whatever direction that is. And I had thought the conference was at the Hilton, so I wandered down to the conference center, and everyone had name tags on, and I was like, this doesn't feel right. It was UOG, and someone came up to me and said, are you here for the conference? I said, well, I'm here for a conference. And they said, this is the urology conference. And I said, I have zero interest in urology. And this woman said, well, what's your conference? I said, homelessness. And she said, well, that sounds interesting. I said, yes, it is. So if any urologists wandered in, welcome to the conference. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to come to a variety of communities around the country to talk about this book. This is a topic that I care deeply about. I have never experienced homelessness. I've never experienced housing insecurity. And so I'm one voice among many voices on this topic. But I hope I can make a small contribution to our understanding of this issue. I moved to Seattle in 2017 to begin my work at UW. And got involved in community conversations around homelessness and housing pretty quickly. And it wasn't long after I got there that I realized that we just, as a community, didn't understand what was going on. And if you've been to Seattle recently, it's not good. We have a terrible, terrible housing and homelessness crisis. And it's gotten far worse in the 5 years that I've been there. And so I realized that we knew information in the academy and in academic scholarship that wasn't really making it out into the general public. And so in talking to colleagues and friends, I said, I think I want to write a book, basically translating what we know in the academy to a general audience to explain why Seattle has such a high rate of homelessness. It's a question that every person who lives in Seattle and San Diego probably asks. What is going on here? What is it about our city? I was just in Chicago and we didn't see this. Right? One of the prompts for me is, I'm from the Midwest, as you heard in my bio. We were in Chicago, and my daughter at the time was 14. We were walking down Michigan Avenue, and she looked at me, and she's like, there aren't any homeless people here. I was like, you're right. There are. They're in shelter, but at a far lower rate than what we have here. So the fundamental purpose of the book was to explain why do some places have lots of homelessness and others don't. Pretty simple question. That's the book. Our publisher was University of California Press. I'm obligated to nod to our publisher. So. When we start to talk about causation, that's something that those of us in the academy think a lot about. And so I took all sorts of classes on causal inference when I was getting my PhD. Causation sometimes can be pretty easy. So if you drop a pencil and say what caused that, we'd say gravity, and that's a pretty simple question. When we get into the social world, causation's really hard because humans are complex. What causes someone to get into Harvard? Well, he or she might be really smart. Maybe their grandparents gave $100 million, right? Maybe they're a good hockey player, right? There are any number of reasons why you might get into Harvard. Maybe there's a combination of those things. Social outcomes are complex. There is no more complicated social phenomenon than homelessness. As I said, I've never experienced homelessness, but I've talked to and interviewed a lot of people experiencing homelessness and those who formerly did. Every story is unique. I would never stand up here and tell you this is the one pathway into homelessness, because I would be lying. Right? All these factors come together to produce a really, really tragic outcome. And so I'm not going to talk about all these different causal pathways in great detail today. What I'm going to try to focus on is why does this manifest itself in some locations and not others? What is the context that produces this? That's the purpose of this book. So every jurisdiction in the country, your COC, I guess I'm talking to people who know the jargon, so I don't know how to explain that, conducts the point-in-time count. And in addition to creating an estimate of the homeless population, we actually do surveys, and we ask people, why are you experiencing homelessness? And this actually comes from the Seattle-King County survey from 2019, and people will say all sorts of answers. I got in a fight with my roommate. My roommate kicked me out, and I'm homeless. Right? I drink too much. I got divorced. And following my divorce, I'm homeless. My husband beat me up. I'm now homeless. Okay? And so when I read these things, and when they're put in the Seattle Times, they'll say these are the causes of homelessness. And I always scratch my head a little bit. Who am I to tell someone that's not a cause of homelessness? I don't believe divorce is a cause of homelessness. I don't. If it were, we should have a heck of a lot more homelessness. Okay? That doesn't mean that I don't believe that divorce in the wrong set of circumstances can produce homelessness. I absolutely believe that. So what we try to do in the book is draw a distinction between what we call a precipitating event and a root cause. Divorce, an argument with your roommate, et cetera, we would call precipitating events. What we're trying to get to is what is the root cause? Why does this become a much bigger issue in some places than others? And one note in terms of our framing, my co-author and I decided to center housing in this book. We could have written a book called Homelessness is an Inequality Problem. We could have written a book called Homelessness is a Racial Justice Problem. We talk about those issues. They're fundamentally important. We made a tactical and strategic decision to center housing. And you may say, you should have centered something else, and that's a fair argument. But that's the decision that we ultimately made, because we fundamentally believe if we can figure out the housing, that we can put a dent in this crisis. So to draw a distinction between root causes and precipitating events, we use this analogy in the book about the game of musical chairs. So imagine you're with 10 friends, you have 10 chairs, you have a leader, the leader starts playing music, and the 10 friends walk around in a circle inside the chairs. And as the game works, the leader pulls one chair out, stops the music, and everyone scrambles for a chair. By definition, someone loses. In this case, it's Mike. Mike was on crutches and wasn't able to move quickly when the music stopped and therefore lost the game. And so if we were interviewing Mike afterwards and said, Mike, why do you think you lost the game? What would he say? I was on crutches. I had a bad ankle. That's what he would say caused me to lose the game. And within the context and the rules and conditions of that game, that's probably right. That's probably right. But if we take a step back and really think about this, why did he not have a chair? It's because we didn't have enough chairs. Okay? This is what is happening in coastal cities around the United States right now, which is when we don't have enough chairs, or in this case, housing units, what happens is people with vulnerabilities are identified as most likely to experience homelessness. Okay? The tech boom in Seattle is unbelievable. And Amazon and Microsoft have been importing very wealthy people at tens of thousands of people every month. It's like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt if you're an Olympic fan. Right? You're going to lose. You're going to lose to the Amazon folks. They have resources and they have everything. They're going to find housing. And if you're vulnerable in some way, if you're experiencing poverty, if you're disabled, if you're addicted, if you're experiencing mental illness, if you have a relational breakdown, you are far more likely to experience homelessness. But the fundamental fact is that if we had sufficient housing units, you'd find housing. And we know that that's true because other communities around the country don't have the same problems that we do in San Diego and Seattle. So we know that, that individual factors such as addiction, mental illness, poverty increase the risk of homelessness. There's no doubt about that. So I'm not going to stand up here and say those issues don't matter. But we do know that those conditions produce homelessness in some contexts and not others, and that's the focus of the book. So the fundamental question, as I said, is why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? Why does Seattle-King County have 5 times the rate of homelessness of Cook County, Chicago? Now, one explanation for that is if these individual factors produce homelessness, if we have more people with those conditions, we would have more homelessness in a community. That's a perfectly plausible and rational explanation for variation rates of homelessness. Turns out it's not right. But it is an explanation that a lot of people fall back into because it makes intuitive sense. So this is a book about cities, not about people. It doesn't mean that person-focused research isn't important. It absolutely is. We're just focused on cities here. What is it about Seattle, San Diego, San Francisco, LA, Boston, New York, DC? What is it about those cities and contexts that are producing homelessness at high rates? And to jump to the punchline here is our thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities. And the vulnerabilities then serve as a sorting mechanism in identifying the people who are most likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. So just to orient you in terms of rates of homelessness, it's really important when you compare jurisdiction to jurisdiction that you compare like COCs to like COCs. Some places count their homelessness at just the city level. And all else equal, they will have higher per capita rates of homelessness because homelessness tends to be higher in the urban core. Other places like San Diego County count at the county level, which all else equal have slightly lower rates. And so when we compare, we want to compare city to city and then county to county. And what you'll see in this graph is that in cities, you've got New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston are about 5 times Indianapolis. So there's about a 5-to-1 relationship between high and low per capita homeless jurisdictions. When you go to counties, and this is based on 2019 data, what you'll see is LA, Santa Clara, King County, Multnomah, which is Portland, are about 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. San Diego is about 2.5 to 3, and you're higher now post 2019, which is when the data cut off for the book. So the point here is that we've got a 5-to-1 difference, which is a huge variation. And we want to understand why is that? And that's true whether you're counting at the city or the county level. So we had spent 3 chapters. The first chapter we look at in an empirical sense is individual factors. Are some of these individual risk factors for homelessness, does it help us understand why some places have high rates of homelessness? Okay. This will not be a statistics lecture. I know you're enjoying your lunch, so I'm not going to get into this in too much detail. But just to orient you, because you're going to see a few of these, the bottom axis of the x-axis is the variable that we're interested in this case, poverty rate. So that would be the percentage of people below the poverty line in each of these counties or cities in the United States. Okay? The y-axis or the vertical axis is the per capita rate of homelessness. Okay? And so when we put all these dots, and each dot represents San Diego County for 2013, 2014, 13 years. And all of the jurisdictions, there are 30 jurisdictions in our sample, biggest cities in the United States. What we see is a relationship emerges. And in this case, what we see is there is a relationship between poverty rate and homelessness, but it is in the opposite direction of what you would expect. There's no doubt that poverty causes homelessness, but when you plot it at a community level, places with high rates of poverty actually have lower rates of homelessness. That's a head scratcher. Okay? So the lower right of this graph is, think Detroit, Michigan. The most impoverished city in the United States has far lower rates of homelessness than relatively affluent cities like Seattle and San Francisco. Okay? So we don't have a problem in Seattle because we have more poor people. In fact, we have far fewer poor people than most cities in the United States. So we can't blame poverty for the disproportionate rate of homelessness in our community. These data on mental illness and drug use are drawn at the state level because the data are better at the state level than at the city or county level. But the point is the same. It's the same logic. This is rates of serious mental illness in every state in the nation from 2007 to 2019. And what you'll see is there is zero relationship to rates of homelessness. There are not more people in California, Oregon, and Washington who are seriously mental ill than other places in the nation. Okay? So we don't see more homelessness where there's more rates of mental illness. There's zero relationship. Okay? The context in which that mental illness happens matters a lot. But it's not that we have more people experiencing those conditions. This is illicit drug use. Again, the R squared here is 0.06, which basically means this is a nothing burger. There's nothing here. Okay? There are drug users in every state in the nation, and more drug use doesn't lead to more mental illness. And same thing with substance use disorder, which would be legal substances like marijuana if that's legal in your state, and alcohol use. Okay? So these individual explanations don't help us understand why some places have lots of homelessness. So now let's go to the local context. What is it about our city that's producing this? And I want to thank the council member for his service. Being an elected leader in a West Coast city right now is a really, really, really hard job. Okay? One of my jokes, I'm not going to make the joke now because we have elected leaders here, is this is why I'm not going to run. This is why I'm not going to run for mayor. It's a really hard job. My job's a heck of a lot easier. Right? So I'm sure you hear this here all the time, but in Seattle, I constantly hear, what are we doing here? We're doing something wrong. We are doing something wrong. There's some policy reason why we have this terrible, terrible problem. Because I was just in Chicago and New York, and it's fine there. That's another topic. It's not. But we hear this all the time. One of the most common explanations I hear in Seattle, and my joke is that if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that weather caused homelessness, I wouldn't be a rich man, but I'd have a lot more nickels. Okay? Weather doesn't cause homelessness. Okay? If you leave here with one thought, weather doesn't cause homelessness. We frequently think about LA and San Diego around the country as cases where you say, well, of course you're going to have homelessness in LA and San Diego. It's lovely here. Okay? Chicago's terrible in January. But we ignore the fact that Miami and Dallas and Phoenix are also pretty pleasant in January and don't have the same rates of homelessness. And we ignore the fact that Boston and New York have two of the highest rates of homelessness in the country and are terribly cold in January. Okay? So weather doesn't cause homelessness. It does affect the policy response, whether you have shelters or not. That's a separate conversation. But in terms of overall rates of homelessness, we can't blame weather for regional variation. The second thing I hear is, well, we have all these generous benefits. Free-addle is the term that they use in Seattle. These generous benefits are causing people to come here and to experience homelessness because it's so awesome to experience homelessness in Seattle. First of all, it's not. The benefits are not that generous, and experiencing homelessness is not a pleasant way to go through life. Okay? So one way that we attack this in the book is to look at how benefits vary throughout the United States. So in 1996, when Bill Clinton was president, we had a major reform of the welfare system in the United States. And the new program is called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. So when you think about welfare, that's what TANF is. Okay? And one of the elements of welfare reform was giving states lots of control over the level of generosity. Okay? And so we have states that are really generous, and we have some states that are really stingy. Okay? So we can actually test this and look at, do generous benefits serve as a magnet for homelessness? And so what we do is we take that maximum benefit state by state, divide by the cost of housing in that location, and say, what does it look like related to homelessness? Again, no relationship. People aren't congregating or locating in places with generous benefits. Why? Because moving is really hard. I moved a family of 4 6 years ago with all the benefits that I possibly could have. It's painful, it's difficult, it's traumatic, it's expensive. If you have no resources, a limited social network, you think I always use the term Topeka. Do you think you're going to move from Seattle to Topeka, Kansas? What are you going to do when you get to Topeka? Okay? So we don't see any effect of this welfare magnet having an impact on rates of homelessness. Another way to look at this is low-income migration. What percentage of the people moving to your jurisdiction are below the federal poverty line? Again, what we see is actually an inverse relationship. Are there some poor people moving to Seattle and San Francisco, the two most affluent places in the country right now? There are, but at far lower rates than Baltimore, St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, et cetera. Okay? We don't see any evidence of this magnet effect. Homelessness is a homegrown problem. Okay? The people experiencing homelessness in your community are, by and large, from your community. And that's true in San Diego, it's true in Seattle, it's true in New York. Is there an anecdote to the contrary? Sure there is, but we don't make policy by anecdote. Or we shouldn't. We may, but we shouldn't. The other thing that we frequently hear is, well, it's politics, it's Democrats are to blame. And that's fine. If we want to blame Democrats, we can blame Democrats, but we need to be at least intellectually honest about doing so. So in 2016, or I guess 2018, President Trump and Governor Newsom from California got into a big public brouhaha over homelessness. And Trump was blaming California and their liberal policies for homelessness. And Newsom was saying, well, the federal government has divorced themselves from low-income housing policy for the last 40 years. We're blaming the federal government. And as we write in the book, neither one of them are right. Okay? Newsom isn't right because if it really was the fault of the federal government's retrenchment, which is part of the story, why would we have huge variation? Everyone should have the same issue, but we don't. Trump was incorrect because what he's failing to ignore is the fact that Democrats basically run cities in the United States. So we actually looked at the 30 cities in our sample for the 13 years that we cover in the book. Democrats run those cities 85% of the time. Mayor Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, was an independent. And then your city, San Diego, and Miami briefly had Republican mayors. Other than that, it was all Democrats. So if we want to blame Democrats for homelessness in Seattle and San Francisco, that's fine, but why don't Democrats produce homelessness in St. Louis and Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago, which have been run by Democrats for generations? Okay? The point is there's something else going on. And the point is that the context in which all these things happen really, really matter. And what you'll see here is the first of these graphs that actually show a meaningful relationship between one of our variables and homelessness. And in this case, it's rents. When rents are high, homelessness is high. Dun, dun, dun. Okay? So no one's going to give me a Nobel Prize for this, right? This is not earth-shattering research. But it's amazing how resistant many people are to this message. Okay? Related, when vacancy rates are really low, homelessness is high. And so, and it doesn't explain all the variation. People say, well, Greg, your R squared is only 4. All right. This is a far more convincing explanation than anything else we looked at. Okay? And what I say to folks is it won't explain all variation, but if you just blindfold me and say, here's the rents and the vacancy rate in a city, I can tell you with a fairly high degree of confidence whether you're going to have a problem with homelessness or not. Okay? So the question then becomes is, if you buy this argument, why do some places have high rents and low vacancies? That's a really important question. Is it because a bunch of people are moving there? That's part of the story. That's certainly the story in Seattle. We've had a huge tech boom and massive inflow of people who make a lot of money. But what's interesting is when you plot population growth and homelessness, there's no relationship. And this is the one graph that I thought I'd messed up. I had to run this 3 times because I thought I'd messed up the data because I was like, this can't be right. And when I actually dove into it, what I found is there are a bunch of Sunbelt cities that are growing really fast. Austin, Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix. And they are not having the same problems with homelessness that coastal cities are. So I realized after I'd done this that this is really an analysis of demand for housing. More people moving there creates more demand for housing. What I wasn't looking at was the supply of housing. So to help hopefully put some context in what I'm talking about today, we created a typology, which just means kind of a grouping of cities to help you think about this. And I'm not going to go through the economics here again. You're trying to enjoy your lunch, and there's Greek letters on the screen. But there's a notion called housing supply elasticity that's really, really important, which is, and elasticity is a common thing in economics. So if I have a pen, and pens go up by 5 times in price tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow? Pen manufacturers are going to make a whole bunch of pens because there's a profit opportunity. And so we'd say it's pretty elastic, meaning the supply of pens is elastic because they can go to 2 shifts, 3 shifts, make a bunch of pens, and make money. Okay? If the price of housing goes up 5 times tonight, what happens tomorrow? Nothing. People may want to build, but you need to get a land, you need to get a permit, you need to have financing in place, you need to find a contractor, supplies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So generally speaking, housing is less elastic than pens. Right? And from city to city, there's variation in rates of elasticity. Some places are easy to build, other places are not easy to build. And it turns out that that is really, really important when we start to think about housing supply and access to housing. Economists have highlighted 2 factors that really impact your housing supply elasticity. One is topography. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to have a responsive supply. And so for those of us who live in coastal cities with mountains, it's harder. It is harder. We don't have the luxury that Topeka has. Topeka is flat as a pancake and can sprawl as long as they want. It's easy for them to accommodate new growth. Easier, not easy, easier than it is here. The second thing is the regulatory environment in which you operate. There are some places that are easy to build and other places that are really hard. San Francisco is the hardest place in the country to build housing, and they need it more than anyone else. Okay? So when you combine challenging topography in San Francisco with a really strict regulatory environment, you don't have enough housing. And what happens? You have really low vacancy rates, you have really high rents, and you got homelessness. Okay? So this is plotting really the demand for housing and the supply for housing on one graph. And so the x-axis, the bottom axis, is change in population. The cities on the right grow rapidly. The y-axis is supply elasticity. So numbers above 1 would be places where you build a lot of housing. Numbers below 1 would be places where you don't build enough housing. So the 2 quadrants I want you to look at is the first one is the upper right. This is the Sun Belt. These are places that are growing really fast, but they build a lot of housing. One for topographical reasons, but also for regulatory reasons. The numbers in parentheses are their vacancy rates. What you can see is the vacancy rates in Charlotte, which has grown incredibly fast, have remained relatively elevated. And as a result, their rents have stayed much more moderate than elsewhere in the country. The bottom right-hand corner of this graph is the perfect storm for a housing and homelessness crisis. Rapid population growth and very inelastic housing supply. You can see my home city there, Seattle, is Exhibit A. And you can see those vacancy rates, 3.1%. A vacancy rate, by the way, 5% is neutral for vacancy rates. Vacancy rates below 5% would suggest that you have a housing deficit. So I know a lot of journalists say, well, look at the vacancy rate. If you multiply the vacancy rate times the number of units, look at all the empty units in San Francisco, LA, That's not the right analysis. There will always be vacancies. So when you see vacancy numbers above 5%, that's a place that has a surplus of housing, which is why you see the Sun Belt managing this better than we are. on the coast, where we have very, very tight housing markets, as evidenced by low rental market vacancy rates. So I do make some elected leader jokes. I apologize, council member, but one path to low rates of homelessness is industrial decline, right? But there are not a lot of people who want to run for the, have that be their platform for running for re-election, right? Let's be Detroit. Yes, right? A 50-year depression, industrial depression. So the point is that Detroit has lots of issues. Homelessness isn't one of them because housing's durable. They built a bunch of housing in the 1950s and 60s, and then they lost a quarter of their population. They've got plenty of housing. They're tearing down housing, actually. They have too much. Okay? So I know that we're not going to pursue a strategy in San Diego of industrial decline. Okay? So the point then is we need to figure out how do we get more housing. Okay? Because otherwise we'll end up in categories 3 and 4, which is these boom towns and big cities with very inelastic housing supply that will continue to have pressures in their housing market. So some context for your community, and I know you all know these numbers, but your last point in time count in 2020, and obviously COVID has disrupted this a little bit. I think 21, if I remember correctly, you did just an unsheltered count. Is that correct? Is that right? Yep, okay. So 7,000 people, about half are unsheltered, which is a pretty consistent percentage from other cities on the West Coast. Okay? This is a very, very troubling and concerning number. But when you look at your housing market statistics at both the city and the county level, what you'll see is this shouldn't be a surprise. The housing market dynamics here show expensive rents and low vacancy rates. Okay? And you can see those vacancy rates have come down since 2010 over the last decade. Okay? So you are fighting a market that is relatively inhospitable here, which makes this work really, really hard. And which is why I'm grateful that this room is filled with people who care about this issue. Okay. To date, our nation, and your community is probably no different, the vast majority of the money that we spend on homelessness are what I would call operating investments. Shelters, the emergency response services, all these issues that are life-saving and important, and we need to continue these investments. But we're fooling ourselves if we think that that's going to end homelessness. We are responding to the crisis, we're not intervening. We also need to think about capital investments to construct more housing. I'm a firm believer that we need a lot more market rate housing in coastal cities. That will not end homelessness, but it's part of the solution. And so what I say to elected leaders that I talk to is we need to create a regulatory environment that will allow for more construction of market rate housing. And hopefully that housing will be denser. We don't need more single family homes. Okay? So dense market rate housing is essential. It's not sufficient to deal with this crisis. We also need resources and commitment to construct housing that's affordable for people with lower incomes. And those resources can be used to increase people's purchasing power, or those resources can be used to subsidize the construction of housing that's affordable. And there are all sorts of programs at the state, local, and federal, state, and local level that do that. And they're good programs, but to date, they have not scaled appropriately to the scale of the problem. And if we continue to just treat this with operating investments and let our housing market do what it's doing, I fear for our communities and the people who are experiencing homelessness, because it's going to be very, very difficult to change a course. And what makes this hard is we have 3 tensions here. On the West Coast in particular, we have a big short versus long-term problem, which is Rome is burning. 3rd Avenue in Seattle is a nightmare right now. Okay? And there's intense pressure on our council members and our mayor and our county executive to take care of this problem, and people are angry. And I understand people's frustration. And so there's huge pressure to devote resources to an emergency response that's short-term in nature. And I understand that, and I do support that. But if we don't focus on the long term, which is ensuring that we have permanent housing on the back end, we will end up in the state that New York is in, which is they have a massive shelter system that they've had for 30 years, and they spend billions and billions and billions of dollars, and people are warehoused in shelters in perpetuity. And so I always say to my colleagues in Seattle is be careful what you wish for. Do you want to be New York 2.0? So this tension's hard, and I wish I had an answer for you. There's a lot of good people working on this. If it was easy, it would have been solved. There's the question of who has the responsibility for this, the public market or the private market, and I would say both. Private market actors need to build, the government needs to make sure that people can build, and we need a lot more public resources. We cannot end this crisis without public involvement. I firmly believe that. And then the last question is, if you believe that the public sector has a role, where should that come from? Washington, D.C., Sacramento, San Diego? The answer is all the above. I hope that we will get more support for housing from Washington, D.C. I think it's essential and needed. But states like Washington and California need to figure this out on their own if the cavalry doesn't come from D.C. So to wrap up here, and then we have a little time for Q&A. The one thing that I hope that I can leave you with today is that I really believe that when we frame and present homelessness as an individual problem, as an individual deficiency, we are undermining our ability to end this crisis. Okay? This is a structural problem. And structural problems require structural solutions. Do we need treatment? Absolutely. Some people say, well, Greg, you're anti-treatment. I'm not anti-treatment. I believe we have a moral and ethical obligation to provide treatment. But I do believe, and I've said this over and over in Seattle, that if I could wave a magic wand and end all addiction and mental illness tomorrow, we'd still have a problem with homelessness. Okay? So we need a structural response, and that structural response means we need a heck of a lot more housing of all types. And so people will say, well, fine, Greg, you got your fancy charts, How do you know that housing will end homelessness? And I'll say, well, we unfortunately don't have a great example of a coastal city that has done this. But what we do have is a shining example, which is the federal government said, we don't want men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan to experience homelessness at the same rates that the Vietnam generation did. And so leaders of both political parties said, we are going to provide resources and energy towards this topic, and what do? We cut veteran homelessness by half in 10 years. And how did we do it? We gave them housing. In some cases it was vouchers, in other cases it was units. Some people needed supportive services, and we provided that, and it worked. And so for those who are maybe skeptical of the argument, we have abundant evidence to show that it works. The question is, will we scale that to the level of the crisis that we have? And to date, we haven't, and I hope we will. Thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Okay.
So we have a couple, let's holler into this. We have a couple microphones in the room. Here. Any questions for Greg? It would be great to dig into some local things.
Oh, well, this is a more general, not a local question. First of all, I want to thank you so much for taking me back to graduate school. It has been a super long time since I thought about elasticity in public policy schools. So what I want to ask you about, when we talk about the reform of regulation, there's a conflicting force around increasing regulation relative to climate change.
Yep.
And I'm not an expert in either area of policy, but it seems like those two things, it's almost like a short-term, long-term thing there. I mean, arguably, if you have great housing in 10 years and there's no air to breathe, then, we didn't solve a problem.
Yep.
So I was just wondering if you would talk a little bit about the trade-offs or the balance or how we should be thinking about the interplay of housing regulation and environmental regulation. And thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I get this question a lot. I actually spoke at a conference at Boston University on this very topic, which was housing access and environmental stewardship, sustainability. And my point there was, are there times where housing advocates and environmental advocates butt heads? Yes, there are. Yes, there are. And I'm not going to ignore that. But I would argue that the times that they are in alignment far outweigh the number of times that they butt their heads. So I firmly believe that a denser built environment that will allow people to live in the urban core and use public transportation is not only good for affordability, it's also very good for our environment. And to me, that alignment overwhelms some of the disagreements that we have. Right? And I have the luxury of not having to navigate those disagreements, and so I'm not going to ignore the fact that there are going to be certain regulations that do increase cost for housing. That is true. And that's where this is why I say this is a hard job to navigate these things for our elected leaders. We need to figure that out. But I firmly believe that there are some big things we can do in terms of thinking about our built environment where those things come in alignment and we can do that good work. I firmly believe that.
Hi. Curious, on solving this and building more housing, it's very, very difficult to build the kind of housing you're talking about, which I agree with from a big picture standpoint at an affordable level. And so we have housing that's getting built for people who can afford it.
Yep.
And there are those who win the lottery and get the affordable housing that's subsidized,
Yep.
right? We can't build enough of it. I'm curious as to how big you think the problem is in San Diego and California, if you did that research, because it's a pretty big number, I believe. And have you seen examples where they're solving that missing middle? Because I remember at one point asking the planning director what the number was, and I asked the mayor what the number was of how many units have been built in San Diego, the city of San Diego, that a middle-income person could qualify for. One, the answer was 3, the other was 10. I'm guessing, and that was over a decade,
Yep.
I'm guessing that was too little.
I would agree with your assumption. Yes. So it's a hard question. I think the scale of under construction of housing is massive. So Puget Sound, I know the numbers up there are a little better than here, but we can translate them. You know, our deficit is about 50,000 housing units right now. That's a lot. That's a lot. And it's estimated to be about 400,000 housing units in the 20 or 30-year plan for Puget Sound region. Okay? So we need to build a ton of housing. When you look at housing construction across the United States historically, what you'll see is it kind of hums along. We built a ton of housing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. The Great Recession hits, and we went like this. We are way, way behind. That's why I want developers to build like crazy. And not all of that will be affordable, to your point. In terms of scale, so in our region, McKinsey, the big consulting firm, estimated that we need 35,000 units of housing for people experiencing homelessness or of extremely low income. 35,000. And pre-COVID inflation, the cost of that was about $10 billion over 10 years. LA's problem is 4 to 5 times what Seattle's is. So LA's problem, if you just use the same math from McKinsey, is a $50 or $60 billion problem. And so I was at a conference at UCLA a couple weeks ago at Lake Arrowhead, and someone said, well, we just passed HHH, $1 billion, and people are upset because homelessness is still a problem. I said, yeah, because you got a $60 billion problem that you threw $1 billion at. It shouldn't surprise us that you're not going to fix it with that. And we're dealing with our housing levy right now, and we're talking about $780 million, and I'm like, so well, how do we communicate this? We need it. I'm glad we get the $780 million. It's not going to end this. It's nowhere near. And so we go out and say, we want to raise your taxes, and we also need to tell you that this isn't going to be enough. Again, this is why it's hard to be an elected leader right now.
By the way, the numbers I have heard are somewhere between 80,000 and 180,000 that were short in San Diego.
Yep.
So that probably costs some money.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money.
Anyway, thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
I know that your book has only been out a few months. Has there as yet been any criticism of it that you either felt the...
Sorry to laugh. The answer is yes.
Has there been any intelligent criticism of it that you either think is valid in whole or in part, or that you would respond to with an easier explanation?
Yeah, great question. I have learned that you have to develop a thick skin if you want to write about homelessness. So I would say the vast majority of the feedback I've gotten has been positive. I've gotten a lot of people who've written and said, you changed my mind, which made me feel really good. And then there's a subset of people who are really, really angry, like really angry, including like sending emails to my dean saying, how dare you publicly fund this guy and his research. Some of the critiques I've gotten that I think are worthwhile are people saying you didn't delve enough into the interaction between individual vulnerabilities and housing market context, and we do talk about that in the book, but I think that is important. Some people have said your recipe is too vague, like we want more detail. I acknowledge that. Other people have said you haven't centered race sufficiently in the book. I acknowledge that. We made a decision. We do talk about race and the importance of race and the disproportionality of black and brown folks in the homeless population, for sure. But those are some of the critiques that I've gotten that I think are legitimate, and Clay and I knew going in that we were exposing ourselves to that. And then the other ones are just tend to be more mean-spirited, who have a different ideological view that I just hit the delete button. For my own mental health. I can feel my blood pressure rising.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm wondering if your research showed any relationship with wages. I think that's a myth that we hear a lot, that if people could just get jobs, if they could get better jobs, if they could get higher paying jobs, that would be the solution. And I think that's something we're always chasing with a stagnant federal minimum wage, with California wages. Even if we're going up to $20, $22, $25 an hour, you're still not able to afford what is like median rent here in this community.
For sure, yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I guess we look at wages in the sense that we do look at rates of poverty, obviously, and so I already talked about that. And so we do talk about wages, though, in the sense that, Seattle's a terribly expensive city. A good chunk of our homeless population is employed, that they are working, right? They're in the labor force, and it's just, we have a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. I don't know what San Diego's is. Are you at 15? Yep. Well, if you work at Starbucks for 15 bucks an hour full time, that's 30 grand a year. And if you do the math, that's just nowhere near of being able to afford a $3,000 rental unit. But I'm also a big believer that we do need to have higher wages. And so I'm always careful to say, we need more wages, we need higher wages, but we also need a heck of a lot more housing that's more affordable, because I think it's hard to get wages high enough to be able to afford market rate rents in Seattle. I'd love for that to be the case, but not everyone is going to make $150,000 at Amazon. It's just not going to happen. And so we got to figure out for people who are making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 how it's going to work. And the example I always use is third grade teachers. If third grade teachers in Seattle can't afford to live in Seattle, you don't have a community, right?
Yep.
So, and I would assume that that's the case in California as well. So anyway, that would be my answer to the wage question. Thank you. One more? Okay.
Hey, hi. I think the distinction between operational and sort of infrastructure is, so we pour billions because it's mostly cosmetic, it's Band-Aids.
Yep.
It's helping individuals, which, who can ever argue with that?
Yep.
But unless the fundamental infrastructure is changed, it doesn't matter how much money you put into it. So I think that's important. The first part of it makes it cosmetically beautiful. You take care of people and put them somewhere else, anywhere else.
Right.
But it doesn't address the problem. I want you to, and then I have a second thing, and I want you to tell me it's true. Okay.
It's true.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The change for me it was really profound. Instead of saying homeless, and when you say like somebody's experiencing measles or COVID, it's not an indictment of them personally. So when I started hearing experiencing homelessness, it was like mind-blowing. During COVID, anybody could be homeless. And it's a state, it's not a personal characteristic. And I think we can do infrastructure change, but unless we sort of change culturally, that's going to be a problem. So you have to say experiencing homelessness is a language that makes a difference.
I absolutely believe that using that language makes a difference. And I think, and there's data around that, right? 5% of the US population experiences homelessness at some point in their life. People are cycling in and out of this condition. And so it is truly an experience. For some people, it's a chronic experience. For others, it's very episodic. And so I think that's super important. The other thing I would say to your first point on infrastructure, we make massive investments. In our region, we're making a $50 billion investment in transit, light rail transit. We need it. We need it. We don't make similar investments in housing because housing is viewed as a private good. Transportation is a public good, housing is a private good. And so when we start to think about housing as infrastructure, as a public good, that the lack of it undermines our ability to do what we want to do, live, work, play in our communities, that will change the conversation. As long as we continue to think about housing as solely a private good, we're going to struggle to do this. All right, I'm at time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Tamara?
So note to self, the next time we'll add a little bit more time for questions. So my apologies for all of those that got up. and wanted to ask questions, we'll make sure we build a little bit more time in, because I think we need to have that discussion and dialogue in this space. So, Gregg, I just appreciate so much. I hope some of the language and the schooling that we got today, you guys now have a mini masterclass in how we calculate housing. But I think the language about it and how we talk about the challenge here in San Diego has to change. It is not a services issue. It is a housing issue. And so, and I am just thrilled that we would kick off our very first conference with such a powerful and really specifically focused on our local challenges, as Gregg did for us. So thank you again, Gregg. Really, really appreciate it. So before we send you guys off to more sessions, and I am just going to apologize and co-commiserate for a minute about the long walk down the hall. I never wear flat shoes to any of these things, so people who know me and have known me for years, still 4-inch shoes today, but we're going to give you enough time to walk down the hall. What's nice about it, though, is once you're down there, all of the sessions will be down there until you join us at the end here. And so please join us in those sessions. We're really excited to have some really robust discussions as well. You know, I want to honor, we talked a little bit about in the opening those with lived experience and how important it is. But, you know, San Diego is unique and leading in a lot of ways around really centering our work on people who have an experience of homelessness, not just those that have a successful one, but those who also have been challenged in the process. And we have been very fortunate to have some really strong organizations that have been working collectively to put that work together. And I just want to give a shout out to the HEAL Network, to our lived experience advisors group, for those that are members of the Voices of Our City Choir and the advocacy they do, and a small but mighty group at All of Us or None, Curtis Howard and those that help in their community as well. It is how we organize ourselves that brings power to our work, and empowering them and lifting them up. They have been a big part of this conference. You're going to really see that shine when we come back at the end of this session and at the end of the day tomorrow. Again, over 28% of those on our panels are people with lived experience. So listen and learn. And so under that, I just want to give you a teaser of what we'll come back to, and I hope that you guys will stay for that. We have our very last session will be here in the ballroom, and it is 100% focused on those with lived experience. Their expertise and talent will be on display. We have a phenomenal family that's going to share their talent of performance, and an amazing individual, Doug Jack, that's going to end the show. He's an Emmy award-winning choreographer who has experienced homelessness in our community, and he's going to bring it home in a really powerful way. So go have strong, honest, authentic conversations in these sessions, and then come back to really celebrate those who have a talent and are just one of us who experience homelessness. Thank you.